and welcome to today's webinar on building a webinar registration service using webhooks and Mailchimp with Contensis. My name is Ryan. I'm the product owner and content strategist for our customer experience management squad. And we're the squad responsible for building, maintaining and improving our websites, contensis.com and zengenti.com, and all of the services and features that come along with those, such as the help desk, the account dashboard, work requests, all that kind of stuff. With me today is John Moore. John, do you want to just introduce yourself?
Yep, hi everybody. I'm John Moore. I'm a customer experience engineer at Zengenti, and I work in the customer experience management team with Ryan, doing a lot of the development and integration work with the various tools and systems that we use.
Thanks, John. And yeah, today we're going to talk about how we use some of the latest features of Contensis to build the custom webinar registration service that you use to register for this webinar, whether you're joining us live or whether you've signed up to watch the recording sometime in the future. We're going to explain how we built a prototypes form service using content types and entries and the new include in delivery setting in Contensis. We'll show how we use webhooks to queue and send emails using Mailchimp transactional, which is also known as Mandrill, when a user first registers for a webinar, and again when the details of the webinar are updated after the event. We'll touch on how you can use a Mailchimp integration package we've built as a starting point for your own marketing automation. And finally, throughout the webinar, we'll aim to demonstrate how you can adopt many of the same techniques that we've used when building your own custom services and integrations. So what was the problem? What was the driver behind us building this webinar registration service that we're talking about? Well, if you weren't a Contensis user prior to 2020, you might not be aware that in the past, we've tended to run at least one physical event a year. We generally hold a conference and then at least one, normally two user groups. And depending on the event, they'd normally be a mix of guest speakers, product keynotes, content workshops, and developer training sessions. But the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic meant that in 2020, we had to put all of those on hold. We couldn't do any physical events, and we had to find another way of communicating with all of you, the Contensis community. So we started producing webinars. We'd run a few webinars before, but not on a regular basis. And the ones that we'd run had normally been in conjunction with partner sites, or we'd used a landing page on our old website. As we didn't have a design for a webinar sign-up page on our new contensis.com site at that point, we used a generic campaign landing page content type we'd already built, which rendered on the site in React. The content type used the classic Contensis forms module to collect user details. And the content type for the landing page was pretty simple. It had fields for a title, introduction, and an image, some booleans, change the landing page layout. And there was a composer for adding additional content when creating marketing landing pages. So things like feature blocks and calls to action. And at this point, Emma, our events manager, was still exploring the kind of information she wanted to include on the webinar sign-up pages. So we didn't really make use of this composer when creating the first few webinars. The pages were pretty simple and stripped back. The form itself used a React package built by our services team for use on other projects. And to add a form to a landing page, Emma or whoever was creating the webinar in the CMS would copy the ID of the form from the forms module, creating an entry specifically for that form using the content type you can see on screen. And then this form entry could be linked to the landing page entry to render it on the page. And the package worked this way so that if people wanted to, they could reuse the same form on lots of different content types and pages. And once people filled in the form posts would be stored in the classic Contensis forms module. The data flow looks a little bit like this. So we use Mailchimp for most of our marketing email, but because the classic Contensis forms module wasn't integrated with Mailchimp, with each new webinar, Emma would go through a lengthy manual process to promote the webinar and manage registration. So a month or so ahead, Emma would send an email campaign to everybody in our email list with a link to the webinar page to sign up. And on the back of this, people would start signing up, filling in the form on the landing page. And each user would receive a plain text automated notification email from the Forms module, kind of a default notification. Emma would then regularly download a CSV list from the Forms module of people who'd registered, and then she'd add them to a new segment in Mailchimp for attendees of that webinar. And then each week before the webinar, Emma would send further email campaigns to the whole list to increase signups, but she'd exclude that segment containing the people who'd already registered. Before each campaign, she'd then have to make sure she downloaded the CSVs of attendees from Contensis and update her segment to make sure she didn't email people who'd already signed up. And then she'd send an email to the segment with the link to access the webinar through GoToMeeting, which we were using at that time. After the webinar had taken place, Emma would log into GoToMeeting, access the list of attendees, and create a new Mailchimp segment containing people who'd attended the live webinar. A few days later, once she'd added start and end cards to the recording, Emma would send 2 follow-up emails with slightly different messaging. The first one would go to the segment of people who attended, thanking them for attending the webinar and providing a link to watch the webinar recording. And then the second email would go to everybody who signed up but didn't attend. So Emma would exclude the attendees from the first segment of everyone that signed up. And that would say, sorry, we missed you. And here's a link to watch the recording. This worked well to begin with, but as our webinars became more popular, we began to run them more regularly. It became difficult for Emma to manually keep track of all this data. And she was really spending more time moving data around than she was organizing speakers for upcoming webinars. And it just happened that around this time, the product team spoke to us and said that we could have a pre-release version of webhooks. So we decided we'd use that to automate this process using Contensis and 2 different Mailchimp APIs. So webhooks would allow us to easily send data from Contensis to an external system, in our case, Mailchimp. Webhooks are set up to listen to certain actions in Contensis, and then when these actions occur, the webhook is triggered and it sends the data to a third-party system. They save developers a lot of time when building integrations. They remove the need to build a separate service or middleware to keep checking or polling the original system to see if anything's changed. And instead, they just listen for that event and then fire when it occurs. The problem we had was that webhooks can't be triggered by the classic Contensis Forms module we were using. So we decided to build a prototype form service that authors could use to create forms using content types, and then the form posts would be stored as entries in Contensis. And that meant we could then trigger a webhook using any of the available options for firing a webhook on the back of an entry through creation or workflow or a number of other things. By using the content type builder, we could actually make use of some of the existing features in there that were useful for building forms as well, such as validation settings that were already built in. So you can see here we've got a validation setting set on the business email field as a required field. And on the front end, we can show that's required and then show the message from the validation message setting in the CMS. We could also use read-only fields to store data that was required by the front-end app, but that we didn't want to show to users, such as this URL here, which is the URL that users are redirected to when they successfully submit a form. And we added the ability to use tabs to create paging in forms. So if we had a particularly complex form, we could split that into pages, present multiple pages with just a few fields on each one to provide a better user experience. And at the same time as this, we also needed a way to organize our integration fields that weren't really being used on the front end at all. So we added the ability to name a tab private and then not send any of that information to the front end. So all of these fields here are used purely for our integration with the webinar service. We then built a set of a standard set of React components to register these forms on the front end. And we incorporated this form into a new landing page that we built specifically for webinars. We modeled a new content type specifically for webinars. We use it to store the content in the webinar landing page itself, including copy, images, and the ID of that content type form that we're using. But we also use it to store other content related to the webinar, such as the URL of the live webinar session, this Zoom meeting that we're having now, a Google Calendar link, and an ICS file for creating calendar invites to include in emails, and a recording of the webinar once it's taken place gets uploaded to this content type as well. While we were writing user stories and doing the research for the design of this landing page with Emma, we identified that there are 3 stages in our webinar lifecycle, really. So there's upcoming webinars, which are webinars that haven't happened yet. At this point, people can sign up to attend, and then on the day of the webinar, we'll email them the link and they can access the Zoom meeting. There are webinars that are pending upload. So this is kind of a gray area after the webinar where we've presented the webinar, recorded it, but we haven't edited and uploaded the recording yet. So at this point, the best thing we can do is offer to take someone's email address and then email them, send them a notification once the recording is available for them to watch. And then finally, there are webinars which are over, the recording's been uploaded and it's available to watch. And in this case, people can enter their details and start watching the recording straight away. And to do this, our code compares the current date and time against the date and time stored in the webinar entry itself to determine whether the webinar has occurred yet. So if the webinar hasn't happened, the call to action above the form simply invites users to register now, and then there's a form that they can submit. If the webinar has happened, but the recording hasn't been uploaded to the entry, then we display a different message. So a user will see this success message rather than being emailed or taken to watch the recording immediately. They'll get a notification telling them that we'll be in touch once the recording's ready. And then if the recording's been uploaded, then the call to action changes to watch now, and the user can simply enter their details and they get redirected to a page with the video on. We also wanted to give users of existing users of Contensis.com the opportunity to log in and speed up the registration. So if you've already got a login for accessing the help desk or the account dashboard, we wanted you to be able to just either log in, or if you're already logged in, click a button and we'd fill in the form in the background and just sign you up straight away. So all you have to do is click that register now button and it all happens automatically without you having to worry about it. And we've used the same technique and form service that we built to build other forms on Contensis.com. So if you've closed a help desk ticket recently, you would have seen this support feedback form that uses the same technique. It's a form content type with a number of fields to gather the data. It's a little bit more complex than our webinar form. It's got some more fields, and it works a slightly different way on the front end with the booleans and text boxes and things, but it's fundamentally the same service. At this point, Emma was running a webinar every month, and she wanted to make use of this new format landing page as quickly as possible. So we decided to release them as a first iteration of our new webinar service so we could get value from our work. And while we were working on the other integrations that we'd need to build with Mailchimp, we could start gathering feedback on what we'd already built. The only problem was that the new form service stored form posts as entries, and there was no easy way for Emma to download her list of everybody who'd registered like she did using the forms module. So we put together a sort of MVP export and import tool that uses the Contensis management API to allow Emma to download a CSV of all the form post entries for a specific webinar. She could then mark who'd attended in the CSV in a spreadsheet editor and re-upload it to Contensis, and the entry data would all be updated with whether somebody had attended or not attended the webinar. This uses a new query language our product team is working on called ZenQL. So you can see there's a field there for ZenQL statement. And adding a statement to this field in the settings screen there will let a user specify exactly what content they want to export at the time. So this example will export any content created using the form webinar sign-up content type that's published, and where the title of the entry in the linked source entry field is introducing blocks. So ZenQL will let you search, filter, and order content to create custom collections, views, and reports like we have in our export tool. And it's going to be released with IntelliSense and a UI to make it a bit more straightforward to build queries in early 2020. So once the forms worked and Emma had a way of downloading the registration she needed, we started to look at how we could automate the communications that she was having to send out manually using Mailchimp and CSVs. So the first thing we did was break down Emma's existing process and combine it with the user stories we created and building the landing page to put together a Miro board showing how our service needed to work. And Miro is something we've used a few times, and it worked really well for this, as everybody involved could collaborate on the board during our Zoom calls. Kyle, who built the bulk of our Mailchimp integration, found the ability to add comments to the board particularly useful when he was swapping key parts of the process out during testing. So he was sending data to different development endpoints rather than live endpoints, and leaving comments on here of the things he needed to swap out when we finally were ready to release this. Plotting the way the service was going to work in this way made it really easy to review with Emma to make sure we hadn't missed anything out, and it gave our team something to refer back to constantly throughout the development process. So that's quite a big diagram. It's hard to get the detail on screen. So I thought I'd just provide a quick breakdown of what it actually says on there. So it goes off into two main branches once someone's signed up. So before a webinar, if today's date is before the date of the webinar, then we fire a webhook to trigger an email confirming the user is registered. We check if a meeting link is added to the webinar entry I showed you earlier. And then if it is, we fire a webhook to trigger an email to the user, including that meeting link from the entry. Once a webinar recording is uploaded to a webinar entry, if the user is marked as attended, then we fire a webhook to send them the attendee email, thanking them for attending, including the link to watch the recording. Otherwise, if they didn't attend, then we send them the non-attendees email saying that we're sorry we missed them, but also including their recording. After the webinar, we follow a slightly different path. So if today's date is after the date of the webinar, then we check whether that recording's been uploaded. If the recording has been uploaded, then we just redirect the user straight away to watch it, as I showed on the landing page before. Otherwise, we wait until that recording is in the webinar entry, and then we fire a webhook, trigger an email to the user with the same sorry we missed your email that we sent to non-attendees, including the link to watch the recording. And for handling all of these emails that are triggered by these webhooks, we decided to use Mailchimp, as we were using it already. And they have a feature called transactional email that we could use to send emails using our API. So the service was previously known as Mandrill, which was a separate Mailchimp product. And while it's slowly being moved over into the main Mailchimp brand, it still uses a different dashboard and is still referred to Mandrill actually inside most of the Mailchimp UI. So unlike email campaigns, transactional emails are automated emails sent from one sender to one recipient. And they're usually sent on the back of some kind of transaction or activity like an online sale, creation of an account, or a password reset request or something. And transactional email is essentially a service that sends these individual emails on the back of an API call from a third-party system, which in our case is Contensis. And the API call generally includes a recipient's email address. There's no list held in this transactional email service. So if we take a look at the Mandrill app, if you've used Mailchimp, you'll see this looks slightly at odds with the newer Mailchimp products, but it gave us everything that we needed to send out these notifications. So there you can see a list of the different templates that we use for the email at each stage of our process. If we take a look here at the Mailchimp templating screen, you can see that there's a drop-down list to send your templates from Mailchimp to Mandrill. And this was one of the most useful features for us because we could quickly use the drag and drop builder in Mailchimp to create the templates that we then push to Mandrill and quickly start using for sending out our notifications. So there's a settings screen once you've imported your email template. You can see the code there for the template itself, and then there's some fields on the left to name and tag and organize your template, and then set a default from address and from name and an optional subject. So we didn't actually use that subject line as we were sending the subject of each email in programmatically from Contensis, but you could, if you wanted to, just set a sort of fallback subject for each email there. And then we can open that in a sort of split view editor here, where you've got a better view of the code and you also get a visual representation of the email. And you can see that on the right, there are several placeholders in angle brackets. And these are placeholders for editable content areas, and they're where we dynamically insert content from our entries in Contensis. So these use Mailchimp's own templating language, and they're essentially HTML tags, and they give us a place to inject the content using the Mailchimp transactional API. So each one of these has kind of got a space where you can customize that email based on what's happened in Contensis. And to give you a bit of a better understanding of that, I'm going to hand over to John, and he will give you a more detailed look at how all the code works.
Thank you, Ryan. Can everybody see the screen?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, thank you. Excellent. Lovely. So yeah, as Ryan said, I'm just going to take you through a demonstration, which will cover some of the aspects that Ryan showed you, and hopefully you'll take away how you could build your own integrations going forward, either with Mandrill and Mailchimp, or use some of the principles that we're about to show to build integrations with other tools, systems, and services that you might use. So this screen that you're looking at here is one of the new webinar landing pages that we've developed. It's a copy of the webinar we are actually watching today, just with a slightly different title and date. And then on the right-hand side, we've got the form that I mentioned earlier, rendered using the standard set of components. And if I just jump over to Contensis, where I've got the form content type open. So at the moment, these form content types are built as standard content types. We are working on a separate form builder screen, which will look very similar to this. It will just have slightly different options and fields. And some of that work has already started, in the sense that we've split out the text field now into short and long text, and we now have separate date and date time fields, and these will just have some pre-configured options. And then there's also the including delivery setting, which if you set that to disabled or false, it means that these form post entries will not be indexed into Elastic, and so they won't be available to be queried and surfaced on the front end side through our delivery API to help keep this content secure. The only way to get at this data is going to be either by logging into Contensis or through our management API, where you need a secure set of API keys to be able to get at it. So just to show and demonstrate some of the options around setting form fields as well, I'm just going to add in a new field, and I'm going to call it contact number. And I'm going to jump onto the validation tab, and I'm going to make this field required, and I'm going to set some custom validation text. I could also do some pattern matching here to ensure that it was actually a valid phone number that people enter. And then finally on the edit tab, I can set the placeholder text. So your contact number here. If I now save and publish that content type and just jump back over to my webinar landing page and refresh, you can see that new field that I just created is being pulled through. And this is the placeholder text. So you can see we can map content type fields and properties to their sort of form field equivalents. And you can see it's set as required. And if I jump back over here and start to fill in the form, you can see there that the validation text appears and renders. It's go, and finally Zengenti, and then I can click on submit. And so that's now gone to our forms service, and it's been posted successfully. And you can see here we've now got my custom success message as well. And I mentioned that we put in a Google Calendar link, and there's also on here a call to action actually, where I can, if I wanted to, add a reminder to my own personal calendar about the webinar. So you can see we pass in the title, date and time, and the description of the webinar as well. I just jump back and now over into Contensis for the next stage. So one of the things that's gone on behind the scenes is that an entry has been created for that form post. So I'm now on the standard entries listing screen, where I've got it filtered to form webinar sign up entries, and also where j.moore is in the email address. And if I refresh, we can see there's the form post that I've just submitted. And if I click into it, we can see there's all the information that I filled in, so my name, email, and various other details. If I jump onto the private tab that Ryan mentioned, so these three down the bottom here, they're very much part of the marketing automation integrations, which I'll touch on in a second. This source entry field, so one of the things that we have done with this sort of new forms approach is, if the form that someone filled in was on a page or a screen that was powered by an entry, we can actually capture that entry ID, pass that to the form service, and then have that appear here against the form post. And that serves two purposes, really. One of those is for auditing and reporting reasons, but also it means that we are actually able to have a single webinar sign up form across all of our webinars rather than separate individual forms. So I mentioned this is processed by a separate service, and one of the other benefits of that is that for that support form that I showed earlier, that is actually using a completely custom set of components. So if you wanted to use this approach, but build forms in .NET perhaps, or different language, or on a non-Contensis site even, you could still post that form data to this form service and have all those form posts stored as entries in your content management system. So that's really largely the forms side of things. What I'm going to do now is just jump onto a different screen, where I'm going to then talk about how we used webhooks to start to trigger our marketing automation. So this is the webhook definition for the webinar sign up form posts. And you can see here it's going to a contensis.com endpoint, which is actually then going to be reverse proxied to our custom interim webinar service. And we did that on this particular occasion because, as you might have seen from Ryan's slides, there was a certain amount of processing and logic and decision making that had to go on in this particular case. So this webhook is listening to or subscribe to any entries that are published that have been created with the content type form webinar sign up. And in terms of the payload or information that we send to our webinar service, it's the sort of default webhook payload. And we did that on this occasion because what we didn't want to do was necessarily tie our webhook payload to our models and content type fields, just in case we had to make any changes, we then wouldn't immediately break these integrations. There are some situations though where you would need to do, or it wouldn't make sense to do a custom payload. And if you use that support form example again, rather than sending emails in that scenario, we actually push a notification to a Slack channel for the support team so that they can see that someone has completed the form. And in that scenario, that is still a webhook in Contensis, but it's actually a custom payload based on the sort of predefined Slack template that we've got set up. But we've got other templates for things like Teams and any other service that you want to integrate with, really, well, they will usually have their webhook payload formats documented. So once the webhook is triggered, this is the actual live data that gets sent to our webinar service. And this is actually the response that we get back from the Mandrill API, including this transactional ID, which you might have seen in the form post previously. So what we're able to do in our service is actually receive responses from a third-party service and then actually, in turn, update entries in Contensis if needs be. And with that in mind, what I am going to do now is just jump into some of the code just to go through some of the key aspects. I'm just going to show you a few key snippets, really, of how we develop the integration. So this first file that you're looking at, this is the routing file, if you like, for our custom service. And this is the endpoint that the webhook you just looked at is going to. And the first thing we do is actually check the version number. And that's because once we've sent the initial thank you for signing up email, and as I'll come on to in a second, queued the reminder email that hopefully most of you or all of you will have got this morning to say the webinar is happening. Any subsequent updates to these form post entries, we don't actually need to do anything in terms of this endpoint, so we can just return a response there. Diving into some of the code, so as well as the version number being sent in a payload, because it's an entry, the entry ID is also sent. And what we're doing here is through the management API, we are loading the entry not only by its ID, but also the version number. And that is because with webhooks, we have implemented automated retries. So if for any reason your webhook fails, we will retry a maximum of 10 times within a 24-hour period. And the time between each retry increases over time. And in that scenario, if, as we are doing in this particular service, making decisions based on the content of entries, if the entry changes between retries, that could cause unexpected issues or unintended behavior within your service. So by getting the entry by the version number, every time a webhook is retried, you will always get the entry back in the state it was in when the webhook was first fired, just to help maintain some consistency there. But once we've got the sign-up entry, we can then use that source entry field to also load the content and details for the webinar. And as I mentioned, we can check the date and time to check whether it's upcoming or not. And if it is, we can start to send the thank you email. So the first stage of that process is to actually map the content from the webinar and the form post entry to some of those fields and tags that Ryan showed you in the templates earlier. So for example, you can see here we're passing in the subject dynamically. And for the thank you email, once we've mapped that content, we're then able to send a message using that particular template using the Mandrill API. So we're just simply initializing a client up here and then sending a message or an email using a particular template. And then the other action that we do here is we queue the pre-webinar email or reminder. And again, we do a similar thing in terms of mapping the content. The main difference here is this send at field at the bottom. So what that allows us to do in Mandrill is actually schedule an email. So emails can either be sent immediately or you can schedule them for a date and time in the future. And those dates and times are slightly different depending on whether it's webinar is in an upcoming state or the recording is available. And that's what this webinar status field here is, along with the webinar date and time as well. Now, when we send the pre-webinar emails, we actually want to listen or capture the response that comes back from Mandrill for two reasons. One is to return the response that you saw in the webhook screen. But the other is because what we want to do is store the pre-webinar transactional ID against the form post sign up. So you can see here we're getting that ID, updating a field against the webinar sign up entry, and then through our management API, updating the relevant entry. And the reason we're doing that is because as part of the automation, to automate as much as we could, if someone unpublishes a webinar because it needs to be cancelled for some reason, which has only happened once, and which was actually the last time me and Ryan did a webinar together, what that will do is that will come to this endpoint. It will, and the endpoint will then get a list of all the signups, and then any that have got a pre-queued email or scheduled email will actually cancel those scheduled emails, just so you don't get a reminder about a webinar that is actually no longer happening. So once we've done all that, for the sort of the third iteration that I mentioned, there was still one bit of a process that needed to be done manually, which is the post-webinar process. So there was still the need to use the CSV tool to export the list from Contensis and export the list from GoToMeeting that we were using, cross-reference the two, and then re-upload and import the CSV file to mark who attended. But as Emma gave a cheeky sneak preview earlier, for those of you who were early, with the move to Zoom, one of the things that did allow us to do is to now fully automate this process, much to Emma's relief, I'm sure. So now what we can do is there is a third sort of endpoint or webhook to do with this process, which is we're listening for every time a webinar is updated. And if we detect that it's in that recording available state that Ryan showed you or mentioned earlier, we'll then kick off the sort of post-webinar marketing automation. So very simply, similar to what we did before, we're getting the webinar entry by the ID and version number. But then one of the new fields now against a webinar is a Zoom meeting ID. And that allows us to get a list of attendees and then loop through those. And then using a ZenQL query, we're actually able to, based on the email and webinar ID, perform a search in Contensis. And we can then map and queue the thank you for attending email. And then what we're able to do is, again, update the form post sign up with the post webinar transactional ID. And that's just so that we don't end up sending you multiple emails. But we can also mark the did attend field as being true as well, and then update the entry. And then we sort of do a similar sort of process further on down in the actual final code for non-attendees. So that was potentially briefing at a high level, but hopefully you've seen how through using our sort of potential new way of implementing forms, webhooks, and potentially your own custom services and our management API or custom webhook payloads. You can very easily do integrations either with Mandrill or with any other tools and systems that you use, and in any programming language as well. So for example, if you've got want to do some e-commerce functionality and you want to take orders, it might be that those orders can be stored in Contensis initially, and then either through a custom payload or an interim service sent on to a back-end e-commerce system. And it could also be that that back office e-commerce system is also where your products are mainly stored, but every time they're updated, they're then pushed to the same service, which in turn, or straight to a Contensis endpoint, and then those products can then be synced into Contensis. So you can very easily create these rich two-way integrations with all the different tools and services that you use. And with that in mind, I'm just going to pass you back over to Rai, because we talked a lot about the Mandrill side of things, but now we're sort of going to look at our separate Mailchimp integration that we've also developed as well.
So thanks, John. Yeah, that pretty much covers how the webinar registration service works. But as John mentioned, we did create one further integration with Mailchimp. So because Emma was no longer creating these segments and uploading CSVs to Mailchimp in the way she was before, she didn't really have a list of people who'd attended specific webinars within Mailchimp itself. So if she had a webinar that maybe wasn't generating signups as quickly or didn't look like it would be as well attended as most other webinars, she had no way of emailing the people who'd attended webinars on a similar theme to say, hey, you might like this webinar is very much like one you've attended before and it looks right up your street. So we looked into using another Mailchimp API and webhooks to send data from our forms service initially into Mailchimp. And we ended up creating quite a full integration package to allow you to send form and user data from Contensis to Mailchimp. So you can do things like add activities to a contents feed. So you can see here, this is my contact, this is me in Mailchimp, and back in July, I signed up for a page experience webinar, and we send over the event as a webinar event. We tell Mailchimp when the person signed up. So this meant that I signed up after the event had happened. So I signed up to watch the recording. The source entry is the webinar entry. So that's the name of the webinar that I watched. And then video uploaded lets me know that at that point, the video was on the page. So I signed up to watch the video straight away. If that was false, it would have meant that I signed up in the interim period before the video was uploaded. So Emma can use this. She can create advanced segments of people who watch particular webinars so that she can send out promotional emails when there's a similar webinar coming up. We also use this integration to handle the interest list, which you might have seen in the account dashboard on contensis.com. So if you go to your account dashboard, you can set your email preferences and you can unsubscribe completely from Mailchimp, from our emails, which uses this integration package, or you can change the interests that you want to receive emails about, which uses this as well. So it lets you create, update, and unsubscribe contacts in Mailchimp like you'd expect, based off webhooks when either form entry or user data is updated. You can also tag contacts. You can add and remove tags. You can add and remove people from interest groups, as I mentioned, and assign those kind of activities or events that I just showed on my profile. And this again uses ZenQL and some liquid templating to let you determine if the form data should be mapped or whether an event or tag should be added to the data based on what's changed in the entry or user that you're looking at. And we're working on making this available soon as an open source package on GitHub. So we've fully documented it. It's just not quite ready to put on GitHub yet, but once it is, it'll be available for anybody to download and use. If you're keen to take a look soonish, then drop us a message on Contensis Slack, and I'm sure we can sort you out with a copy of that particular package. In terms of what we've covered today, the key takeaways, we hopefully explained how webhooks make it easier to send data from Contensis to other systems when changes occur in your CMS. We've shown how storing form posts as entries will allow you to harness the full power of those webhooks to send data to third-party systems. Hopefully that will be coming as a native feature sometime in early 2022. And our new Mailchimp package will cut the time it takes to start sending data from Contensis to Mailchimp. So if you want to build email journeys or anything like that in Mailchimp using data in Contensis, then this package will let you do that. As I mentioned, if you want access to that Mailchimp integration, then let us know on Slack, or any other questions about this stuff, just fire them over on Slack and we'll be happy to answer on there. And yeah, thank you for attending.